The moment Washington hiked tariffs on steel and aluminum to 35%, Ottawa reacted swiftly. Canada rerouted its shipping schedules to ports in Europe and Asia. State-backed loans were fast-tracked to send Canada's low-emission metals to Antwerp, its lumber to Yokohama, and its clean energy aluminum to Germany. At home, Made in Canada rules were reinforced, and Western rail lines doubled. The once tightly integrated North American supply chain is now evolving into a global corridor system stretching across 3 continents. So how will the United States react to rising production costs as it loses access to its nearest trading partner? Will Washington raise trade walls even higher, risking a full-scale trade war? Or will it try a different strategy to reverse Canada's move toward diversification? Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and like this video to stay informed. On July 31st, 2025, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney opened a press conference in Ottawa with a clear message. Whether it's lumber, steel, autos, or aluminum, Canada will not allow its supply chains to rely on a single market. His words challenge the 4-decade-old structure of United States-Canada trade ties. Just hours later, the White House announced the removal of a selective exemption on its 25% tariff for Canadian and Mexican steel imports, and confirmed that the rate would climb to 35% by year's end. Naturally, journalists asked about retaliation. Carney answered that imports from the United States worth 45 billion Canadian dollars would be repriced, with European and Asian alternatives replacing American products. He also revealed that the federal cabinet had activated a mandate to diversify export routes, with national lenders now focused on opening up trade to the North Atlantic and Indo-Pacific regions. This wasn't just political theater. The numbers are real. By the end of 2024, Canadian exports to the United States included 11.6 billion Canadian dollars in machinery and semi-finished steel, 9.3 billion in raw aluminum, 8.8 billion in lumber and wood panels, and 64.2 billion in automotive products. In total, nearly 100 billion Canadian dollars in exports is now facing a direct cost increase due to new United States measures. Carney's government made it clear, Canadian exporters will not shoulder that cost alone. Instead, they're shifting direction, fast. The first pivot is towards Europe. Canada's trade deal with the European Union, CETA, still provides tariff-free access. Plus, as of January 2025, the European Commission has placed Canada on its Green Lane exemption list for low-carbon steel. That means scrap-based steel from Thunder Bay and Hamilton, produced in electric arc furnaces, won't face Europe's carbon border tax. That gives Canadian steel a pricing advantage of €34 per ton for European buyers, making it highly competitive on construction sites in Central Europe. To support this shift, Export Development Canada and the Business Development Bank of Canada are offering credit guarantees to major steel distributors across Europe from Denmark to Spain, allowing them to lock in long-term, fixed-price contracts with Canadian producers. The first wave alone is set to ship 2 million tons of flat steel products through the St. Lawrence Seaway to the Port of Antwerp. That single route will reroute 18% of U.S.-bound steel exports to Europe and Asia. Aluminum, meanwhile, is winning on environmental merit. Quebec's aluminum is powered by hydroelectricity, giving it a carbon footprint just 1/10 the global average. Under the EU Green Deal, aluminum made this way avoids extra taxes. Swiss aluminum giant Constellium, along with a BC-based potline firm, signed a preliminary deal in Brussels to process 700,000 tons of Canadian aluminum into finished goods in Germany and France by 2030. The deal is valued at 4.88 billion Canadian dollars, more than enough to offset the 600 million Canadian dollar cost hike from U.S. tariffs. On the lumber front, Canada is leaning on old habits. After years of U.S.-Canada softwood lumber disputes, Canadian producers already had footholds in Japan and China. Though over 70% of lumber still went to the U.S., Asia's share grew by 15% over 5 years. Now, that shift is accelerating. So Ottawa is boosting port capacity in Vancouver and also expanding the container terminal at Prince Rupert. The new target is 12 million cubic meters of lumber exports to Asia every year, which is worth about 6 billion Canadian dollars. Now, the Forest Products Association says that increased demand in South Korea and India should, help cover the added logistics costs. The automotive story, well, it's definitely more tangled. Ontario's assembly plants are, honestly, deeply tied to the U.S. market. Windsor and Oakville factories really depend on Detroit's supply chain. Nearly 86% of their production actually crosses the border. Tariffs are expected to add around 3,000 Canadian dollars to every vehicle sold in the U.S., which is, frankly, a serious blow to competitiveness. In response, Ottawa is, doubling down on electric vehicles. To sell EVs in Europe, battery supply chains have to be retooled to meet local content rules. That's why the government is allocating 2.4 billion Canadian dollars from its Industrial Strategy Fund to accelerate cathode production in Ontario's so-called Battery Valley. The aim is to export EVs from Stellantis and Volkswagen plants, tariff-free, to Europe by 2028. Carney's package isn't just about exports. It also strengthens Canada's domestic industries. The proposed Made in Canada procurement rules will drop the threshold for public contracts from 15 million Canadian dollars to 5 million Canadian dollars and raise the domestic content requirement for steel and aluminum from 60% to 80%. That means, more local demand. For example, a subcontractor working on British Columbia's rail expansion had planned to buy Chinese steel. Now it must source from Hamilton. These rules guarantee a baseline of domestic sales to offset declining exports to the U.S. Let's look at the early results. Canada is set to redirect 6 billion Canadian dollars in steel, 4.88 billion in aluminum, 6 billion in lumber, and 1.5 billion in autos away from the U.S. in Phase 1, a total of 28.3 billion Canadian dollars within a single year. Phase 2, which will include EV batteries and agri-food exports, could push that figure past 40 billion Canadian dollars. That's around 8% of total U.S.-Canada trade. Beyond trade, Ottawa is also investing in innovation. An additional 9.7 billion Canadian dollars will go to the Strategic Innovation Fund. Grants will focus on boosting manufacturing productivity, low-emission metallurgy, and AI-driven materials science. The idea? Turn Europe's carbon rules into a competitive edge by modernizing Canada's supply chain. Talks are also ongoing with Japan and Singapore under the CPTPP to add new origin rules. This would prioritize Canada's low-carbon metals for Asia-Pacific electrification projects. To protect exporters from tax shocks, Canada is launching an ultra-green border credit program. Starting in 2026, companies emitting less than 40 grams of CO2 per kilogram of product will qualify for subsidies, helping them stay competitive internationally. Domestically, while opposition parties support retaliatory tariffs, they've raised doubts about Canada's infrastructure capacity. The Conservatives argue that West Coast ports are already overloaded and, frequently hit by delays from strikes or weather. Globally, Canada isn't limiting itself to Europe and Asia. The Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC, is exploring deals for Canada's hydroelectric-powered sulfuric acid and green steel. GCC construction companies see Canadian metals as a key to raising global building standards. This actually forms the third geographic pillar of Ottawa's export plan. Now, let's talk about the American side. U.S. manufacturers that rely on Canadian materials are already feeling the pinch. Steel pipe producers in Alabama used to import slabs from Canada. Now they face spot prices of $570 per ton. Homebuilders in Georgia are recosting mid-range housing due to softwood price hikes. And a Maryland EV parts maker dependent on Canadian aluminum will now pass higher molding costs onto customers. Washington's tariff wall may claim to protect national interests, but honestly, it's squeezing United States buyers. Canada's shift won't fix that pain. It will take time for the United States. Canada says the negotiation door remains open. But as Prime Minister Carney put it, what we can control is Canada's resilience. That signals a permanent strategy shift, one pretty similar to Australia's pushback against China over wine and iron. This isn't a temporary fix, it's a long game. If successful, it could rewrite trade maps. If not, high shipping costs could still weaken Canada's global edge. The real test will come in the next 2 years, as shipping contracts expire and Europe's carbon tax fully takes hold. In the short term, Canada takes a hit, but in the long run, it's building a new web of trade. with green metal going to Europe, certified timber to Asia, clean steel to the Gulf, and a domestic market reinforced through public procurement. The 35% tariff hasn't isolated Canada. It's expanded its global footprint. With trade flows shifting from roads to sea lanes, the balance between Atlantic and Pacific freight and the infrastructure to support it will define Canada's economic future. As for Washington, how long can it justify higher costs for its own industries under the guise of national security? The answer will come through next year's inflation data and the priorities of swing voters. What's your take on this trade showdown? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more updates.